They pulled her out of first class like she didn't belong, like her skin color was an error the airline needed to correct. No questions, no explanation, just a silent, practiced shuffle. One moment she was standing with a boarding pass she paid for, the next, she was surrounded by uniforms insisting she step aside for someone more appropriate. You could feel the injustice in the recycled air. But what no one on that plane knew, what not even the smug executive slipping into her seat realized, was that they had just humiliated the wrong woman. This wasn't just a seat. This was a spark, a trigger, a crack in a system that had been operating unchecked for far too long. And she, the black woman they tried to disappear, wasn't going quietly. The story you're about to witness isn't fiction. It's a reckoning. And it started the moment they told her, without saying it out loud, "People like you don't sit here." So before we unravel how one woman turned humiliation into a billion-dollar collapse, hit that like button, subscribe to follow every twist, and tell us in the comments, which part shocked you the most, and where are you watching from? Let's talk. This is only the beginning. At precisely 6:48 a.m., the pre-dawn quiet of Terminal D gave off that peculiar blend of calm and performance, where the air smelled of overpriced espresso and just dried carpet, and every traveler moved with the urgency of someone who thought they were already late. The early flight to San Francisco was boarding on time, according to the sleek digital screen over Gate 42. Nearby, a luxury brand ad glowed silently across the wall, reminding passers-by that comfort had a cost, and some had earned it more than others. Amara Blake stood beside the gate with a subtle grace that drew no attention but left an impression. She was dressed in tailored navy blue trousers, a high-collar white blouse, and a sand-colored trench that draped softly over her shoulders. A slim leather tote rested on her arm, and the glint of a stainless steel watch at her wrist marked both precision and restraint. She wasn't the kind of passenger who flashed status. She simply embodied it. Her boarding pass, stored digitally in the airline's app, clearly read, "First Class Seat 2A." She hadn't picked that seat by accident. It was her preferred side, with a view over the wing and enough distance from the lavatory to ensure peace. She had chosen this flight specifically for its quiet time slot, ideal for mentally prepping for the pitch awaiting her in Silicon Valley. Amara had built her company from a single laptop and 2 maxed-out credit cards into a consultancy sought by global firms looking to restructure. She knew the value of clarity, timing, and presence. That morning, she had all 3. She approached the boarding lane just as they called Group 1. The gate agent barely looked up before scanning her code. The device pinged green. She offered a polite smile, receiving none in return. Not unusual, not surprising. She walked down the jet bridge at a calm pace, her heels silent on the industrial carpet. The aircraft doors stood open, and a flight attendant waited with a neutral expression that strained to appear welcoming. Her name tag read, E. Anders. She was tall, mid-40s, hair wound into a knot so tight it tugged her forehead upward. Her smile was the kind that didn't touch the eyes. "Boarding pass, please," she said. Amara blinked, slightly confused. "I already scanned at the gate." Anders held out a hand anyway. "Security cross-check." "Just a moment." Amara passed over the screen. Anders examined it for longer than made sense. She tapped the screen, then frowned. "It looks like there's been a change. Your seat's been reassigned." The words hit oddly casual, like a menu revision. Amara straightened slightly. "Excuse me." Anders handed the device back. "You're now in seat 21C. Amara processed that for a beat. 21C was not first class. It wasn't business either. That was economy near the back. Middle seat. No view. "Why was I moved?" she asked. Her tone was measured, not hostile. Anders shrugged with performative helplessness. "It happens. Corporate priority. A special guest needed placement in your row." "And they couldn't pick another seat?" Amara asked. Anders' voice dipped half a note. "Your seat was the only one available for the adjustment." Behind Amara, footsteps echoed as another passenger approached, wheeling a silver carry-on. A man in a charcoal blazer stepped onto the plane, flashing a boarding pass without being asked. Anders greeted him with a warm, "Welcome aboard, Mr. Halberd," and ushered him toward 2A. He passed Amara without a glance. She caught only the scent of bergamot and arrogance. "So," Amara said, still calm but firmer now, "you moved me from my paid seat without warning or compensation?" Anders gave her a look meant to be sympathetic, but failed. "Feel free to speak with the cabin manager." "Please do," Amara replied. A few moments passed before another uniformed figure emerged. He wore navy with gold stripes at the cuff and a laminated badge that read, "David Lang, Flight Operations Lead." He had the smile of someone trained in conflict resolution but tired of doing it. "MS. Blake," he began, "we apologize for the last-minute shift. A high-priority request came in just before boarding. Unfortunately, it affected your seat." "So you bumped me," she said, "without telling me." "It's not personal," Lang replied. "Of course not," Amara said. "It never is." She didn't yell. She didn't raise her hand. Instead, she opened her phone, pulled up her receipt, her seat selection confirmation, and the time-stamped booking record. She held it out. "Here is proof I purchased this seat." Lang nodded slowly, clearly stalling. "The manifest has already been updated. I can offer you a voucher for a future upgrade." "No," she said. "I didn't buy a voucher. I bought this seat." David's smile faltered. "Ma'am, if you could please step aside so we can continue boarding." "You want to remove me quietly," Amara said. "Let's not pretend this is protocol." At that moment, a teenage girl across the aisle raised her phone, clearly recording. Amara noticed, didn't stop her. Another passenger leaned toward his companion and whispered, "She's being bumped." From first class. More heads turned. Whispers grew. A businessman 3 rows back shook his head. The tension shifted. Amara didn't flinch. She turned her phone, opened the camera, and snapped a photo of Halberd now settling into seat 2A. She followed it with a shot of Lang's badge. Then the digital manifest, blinking on the crew's tablet. With a few taps, she composed a message. "Flight 219 San Francisco Airport route. Confirmed reassignment from paid first-class seat to economy for unregistered VIP passenger. Possible discriminatory practice. Evidence attached." She hit send. Back on the jet bridge, Lang's voice softened. "MS. Blake, we're happy to speak with you after takeoff. For now, I need you to proceed to your new seat." Amara paused, adjusted the strap on her bag, and gave him a look that could have frozen ocean water. "You know exactly what this looks like. And I want you to remember, when this goes higher, and it will, that I gave you the opportunity to make it right." Without another word, she turned. But not toward 21C. She stepped off the aircraft, back into the boarding tunnel. "There." She made a call. "It's me. Activate Protocol Bravo. Put legal on standby. Press 2. They're going to want to see this." She ended the call. Through the glass wall, the plane gleamed under rising daylight. Clean lines, quiet engines, and a seat she had earned, now occupied by someone who looked the part better than she ever would, at least of them. But this wasn't over. This was only the first warning shot. Amara re-entered the aircraft not because she accepted defeat, but because she knew that stepping back was sometimes the best way to launch forward. The door hissed shut behind her, and the cabin lights overhead dimmed slightly, mimicking the transition from day into flight mode. She walked the narrow aisle towards seat 21C with the silent poise of someone charting the perimeter of a future courtroom. Her posture remained perfect. Her pace never broke. As she passed through the premium cabin, she caught a glimpse of Mr. Halberd unfolding his newspaper with all the confidence of a man who believed himself entitled to everything he had. He didn't notice her. Most people like him rarely did. But the silence around her grew thicker. A few passengers, eyes half curious, half embarrassed, glanced up from their tablets. They knew what they'd seen. They just weren't sure if they wanted to get involved. One elderly woman in a window seat pressed her lips together and gave Amara the faintest nod. It was the kind of acknowledgement that said, "I see you," even if it didn't carry the weight of intervention. Amara took note of every detail. The uniformity of indifference, the way the crew avoided eye contact, the exact timestamp when the plane began to taxi. When she arrived at row 21, she found the center seat between a young man with massive noise-canceling headphones and a woman in a wrinkled tourist hoodie already asleep against the window. With no help from the flight attendants, she lifted her own bag into the overhead bin and sat without a word. The seatbelt clicked. Her elbows folded inward to accommodate the strangers pressed on either side. It was a deliberate fall from comfort, and it was not a coincidence. The moment she settled, her phone vibrated inside her coat pocket. She pulled it out discreetly. A message blinked on screen from one of her internal corporate analysts. Incident registered. Initial flag for escalation. Will begin soft press sweep unless you say otherwise. She typed only 2 words, observe first. She wasn't going to fire prematurely. Not yet. The real story wasn't what had just happened. It was why. And to find that out, she needed to watch carefully. The plane lifted from the ground with a rumble that passed through Amara's ribs. Out the small window across the aisle, dawn was crawling across the clouds. The man beside her scrolled Instagram with one hand and ate trail mix with the other. The woman in the hoodie coughed into her sleeve. Neither gave her a second glance. The attendants began their routine. Safety announcements, beverage carts, courtesy smiles that stopped just short of sincerity. From her seat, Amara noted how fast service began in first class. Within 15 minutes of takeoff, she saw champagne flutes being handed out, tiny linens placed gently on tray tables. She counted 3 attendants circulating in the front 12 seats. In economy, 40 minutes passed before the first cart reached her row. She asked for sparkling water. The attendant, a young brunette with a flighty, hurried energy, handed her a warm can without a word and moved on. No ice, no cup. Amara documented the difference, not because she was thirsty, but because she understood patterns. Inequality often wore subtle disguises. Across the aisle, a teenage boy with a camera bag leaned into his mother and whispered something, gesturing toward Amara. She didn't hear, but she recognized the body language. His phone was angled discreetly toward the front cabin. Recording. Good. She wouldn't be the only one with receipts. Her hand dipped into her tote, pulling out a slim, matte black notebook. She flipped it open and began jotting notes in careful script. Time of reassignment. Lack of disclosure. Confirmation of paid ticket. Denied access to assigned seat. Reassigned without consent. Preferential treatment of non-minority passenger. Potential systemic flag. She paused. Her pen hovered over the last line. Then she added, crew compliant. Culture complicit. Another vibration pulsed from her phone. A new message. This time from Camille Owens, a political journalist. She had helped during a major infrastructure probe 2 years earlier. Camille had seen the early social media posts. One of them had been clipped from the teenage boy's story on Instagram. Now over 20,000 views in just under an hour. The caption read, Lady in 2A got kicked for no reason. She handled it like a boss. Flight 219. SFO bound. Watch this space. Camille's message was brief. You want this out front page or buried in op-eds? Amara stared at the text, then at the top of the cabin where a small monitor displayed flight time remaining. 2 hours, 41 minutes. She typed back, neither. Not yet. I want them to bury themselves first. An hour passed. Somewhere over Colorado, turbulence rocked the cabin lightly, shaking plastic cups and loosening naps. Amara remained still. Her mind wasn't on the sky, but on a pattern she had long suspected and now saw with unsettling clarity. She knew enough about airline seating systems to understand that changes didn't happen randomly, not in first class, not for last-minute VIPs, and certainly not without a documented override. She suspected someone on the crew, perhaps Lang or Anders, had intentionally triggered the change. But why? Racism was too easy a word, too big and too convenient. What she wanted was the exact mechanism, the step-by-step breakdown of who decided what and when. That was where justice lived, not in accusation, but in undeniable architecture. Her notebook filled quickly. Every 30 minutes, she documented timing intervals of service. She noted how many times crew walked past her row without checking in, even when her cup was empty or tray out. She watched how other passengers, particularly those who looked the part, were treated with casual reverence. She circled and boxed observations. Her seatmate eventually fell asleep, head tilted back, mouth open. The woman beside the window woke briefly to sneeze, then returned to slumber. Amara remained awake, focused, watching. Every time the curtain to first class shifted open, she leaned slightly. She watched Mr. Halbert's interactions. At one point, he laughed loudly and clinked his glass with the flight manager, Lang. They shook hands. Their ease was telling. The kind of ease that came from prior arrangement. Maybe this wasn't Halbert's first reassignment. At that moment, something strange happened. An overhead bin in first class popped open mid-flight. A flight attendant quickly rushed to secure it. But before she could, something caught Amara's attention. Nestled between two carry-ons was a black hardshell case. It had no tag, no airline label, and it looked official. Her eyes narrowed. A suitcase like that didn't belong in passenger storage. She leaned forward, angling for a clearer look. Before she could, the attendant shut the bin and pulled the curtain again. Amara flipped to a new page and wrote, "Unlabeled black case. Overhead bin. Row 2. Appeared restricted. No passenger tag." Then she drew a small box beside it. Her pen underlined it twice. It hadn't been touched since takeoff, and yet every time the curtain to first class shifted, a different flight attendant seemed to glance up at it briefly, then carry on with their tasks. That kind of repeated, silent attention was never random. Amara had studied behavior patterns as part of corporate restructuring assessments. She knew how to read tension camouflaged as routine. She knew when people were pretending not to care about something that mattered far too much. She waited until the aisle cleared and the service carts rolled back into their compartments. Then, as casually as if she were stretching, she pulled her phone from her coat pocket and opened her secure communication app, one designed not for everyday texting, but for discreet message encryption used only with her high-clearance contacts. She selected the name, R. Darnell DHS Oversight, and typed with brisk economy, Flight 219 en route to San Francisco Airport. Anomalous object observed in FC overhead. Black untagged case. No passenger ID. Possible policy violation or smuggling. Cabin behavior inconsistent. Recommend passive intercept on landing. Do not disrupt flight. She attached the timestamp photo she had managed to capture earlier from her discreet angle, then press send. The app confirmed message encryption and secure relay. She exhaled slowly, folded her hands over her lap, and resumed the role of an inconvenienced passenger minding her own business. In truth, she was no longer just watching a case of bias. She had stumbled into something larger, something that smelled of misuse of power and covert privilege operating under the guise of protocol. Minutes passed before her phone buzzed again. It was a single-line reply from Darnell. Noted. Manifest pulled. Flagged. Shadow eyes on arrival. Sit tight. That was all she needed. The wheels had started turning, and she would let them roll until they ground over everything that had tried to move her out of place. In the rows ahead, the cabin buzzed with normalcy. A baby cried 2 rows down. A group of 3 college students laughed quietly over a shared set of earbuds. The older woman across the aisle leafed through a paperback novel. None of them knew what was in motion now, and none of them would know until the doors opened in San Francisco. But Amara had a job to do before then. She leaned forward and adjusted her seatbelt as if preparing to nap, then carefully slipped her hand inside the tote by her feet. From a side zipper, she pulled out a small black rectangle that resembled a portable charger. In reality, it was a discreet wide-angle audio recorder with a 24-hour battery life and magnetic grip. She held it in her palm for a moment, then stood as if heading to the restroom. She walked calmly through the aisle, past the galley, and entered the first-class curtain, just long enough to drop the device into the space between the seat wall and the luggage bin across from Mr. Halbert. She didn't linger. No one noticed. At least, not obviously. A junior attendant glanced her way, but said nothing, assuming she was stretching her legs. Within seconds, Amara was back in her seat, face relaxed, breath even. Her phone buzzed again, this time with confirmation from the paired mic. Audio stream active. Target area logged. She placed the phone back into her tote and resumed her surveillance with subtle detachment. If Halberd, Lang, or any of the crew exchanged anything relevant in the vicinity of that case, she would have the record. The woman beside her shifted in sleep, briefly brushing against Amara's shoulder, then settled again. Outside, the sun crept higher over a blanket of clouds, casting thin bars of gold light through the window edges. Flight time remaining, 1 hour, 27 minutes. Amara checked the flight map on the headrest screen of the row in front of her. They were approaching Nevada airspace, making good time. She stared at the animated path for a long moment, then opened her notebook again and wrote, "High probability of operational abuse. Suspect, Halberd. Role unclear. Behavior entitled, coordinated. Possibility of coordinated security failure. Secondary suspects, Lang Ops, Anders compliance deviation. Untagged luggage equals contraband or secure courier." She circled the last line 3 times. She wasn't playing a game anymore. She was compiling a case file. Another passenger sneezed 2 rows down. The flight attendants continued their routines, pouring lukewarm coffee and distributing cookie packets, like everything was normal. But Amara could feel the edges tightening. The subtle signals, how Anders kept glancing up the aisle with false casualness, how Lang walked through first class more than necessary, suggested that someone knew something was exposed. They weren't reacting with panic yet, but the tension had shifted. It was as if they sensed something had gone off script, but didn't know exactly what or who had noticed. Amara pulled out her phone and checked social media again. The story was still circulating. The clip from the teen's Instagram had crossed 100,000 views. It had been reshared by a journalist known for tracking corporate ethics violations. The headline he added was simple but sharp: "When they think you're nobody, and you're watching everything." Amara didn't smile, but a flicker of steel flickered in her eyes. This was no longer just a personal incident. This was exposure. And it was escalating. "A few rows ahead, mister." Halberd called over Anders and whispered something to her. She nodded, looked toward the rear of the plane, then walked down the aisle. She stopped briefly at row 21. Her eyes met Amara's. The look was brief but calculated. "MS. Blake," she said, not using a friendly tone. "Would you like to change to a window seat? We just had one open near the emergency exit." Amara cocked her head, unreadable. "Is that an upgrade or quarantine?" Anders blinked. "I'm sorry. No, thank you," Amara replied smoothly. "I'm quite fine where I am." Anders gave a stiff nod and moved on. But the message had been clear. They knew who she was now, and they were trying to isolate her. Too late. She already had everything she needed. Another buzz. Darnell again. Confirmed. Halberd connected to logistics firm under federal inquiry. Flight manifest anomaly under internal review. Will intercept at gate. Stay silent. Amara read the message twice, then shut her screen. Her fingers rested lightly over her lap as she breathed evenly. She had seen powerful men fall before, not always because someone pushed them, but because someone turned on the light while they were doing something dark. That was all she had done here. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't begged. She had simply refused to be dismissed, and in doing so, had exposed something much larger than a stolen seat. The captain's voice came over the intercom with a gentle hum. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into San Francisco. Please return to your seats and ensure all carry-on items are stowed." Around her, passengers stirred. Devices were shut off. Shades were lifted. Belts clicked. Amara glanced up at the digital readout. 12 minutes to touchdown. That was all the time left before consequences would begin landing, one by one. She tucked her notebook back into her tote, closed the zipper, and rested her hand on the top. She wasn't angry. She was focused. They had made a decision to erase her because they thought she was invisible. The seatbelt sign lit up in steady orange as the captain's voice faded from the intercom, signaling their descent into San Francisco. The cabin adjusted itself like a living organism. Passengers uprighted their seats, attendants briskly checked aisle rows, and the buzz of landing anxiety filled the air with a subtle static. Amara didn't move. She remained centered, calm, gaze focused on the back of seat 20C while her thoughts remained tethered to that black case in first class, and the stream of audio still being recorded 3 rows ahead. A soft chime confirmed the automated protocol from her recorder, a backup system designed to export a data package to her secure cloud once it passed the 2-hour threshold. The upload had already started. In less than 60 seconds, a digital copy of everything spoken near the bin above seat 2A would be distributed to 3 destinations: her private legal team, a contact in FAA regulatory compliance, and a journalist specializing in corruption tied to federal contracts. The most powerful thing in the cabin at that moment was not Halbert's false confidence or Lang's managerial title. It was a quiet file transferring quietly through satellite bandwidth on its way to exposure. Up front, the tension was no longer subtle. Lang paced the front of the cabin twice in under 3 minutes, murmuring to Anders each time, voice low, but his gestures increasingly stiff. The curtain between first class and business had remained closed longer than necessary, and on his last pass, Amara noticed Lang glancing backward at her. Their eyes met only for a fraction of a second, but the message in his face was clear. He knew she had done something. He didn't know what, and he was terrified to find out. That's when the shift happened. Halbert rose from his seat before the plane had even finished its descent. He walked toward the lavatory under the guise of urgency, but Amara had already memorized the cadence of deception, and this wasn't bathroom related. His hand never left the edge of the overhead bin above row 2. He paused, turned his body to block visibility, and attempted to unlatch the case that had sat untouched since takeoff. But the moment his fingers fumbled with the dial lock, Anders emerged from the galley, speaking in a hurried whisper. She said something Amara couldn't hear, but the urgency in her tone betrayed the calm she tried to display. Halbert froze. Anders gently placed a hand on the bin and motioned him back to his seat. He didn't protest, but his jaw flexed. Whatever plan they had constructed was unraveling fast, and the closer they got to the ground, the more frayed their facade became. Back in 21C, Amara leaned back slightly and repositioned her tote under the seat in front of her, a gesture that concealed the quick glance she took at her phone. The file transfer was complete. A second chime vibrated. Then a third, this one different. A message from Camille Owens. Audio hot. They're talking about non-compliant cargo. Lang sounds nervous. Sending transcription soon. Amara tilted her chin downward and closed her eyes briefly as if preparing for the landing. But behind her eyelids, she was already drafting the first few lines of a press release she wouldn't even have to publish herself. The system would eat them whole. As the wheels touched down, the plane bounced once, then settled into a steady roll along the tarmac. A hush fell over the passengers, the kind that always accompanied the realization that they'd survived another flight without incident. But incident was relative. For most, this journey had been uneventful. For Amara, it had been confirmation. The hum of the engines slowed. The cabin filled with light. San Francisco's terminal came into view outside the windows. The passengers clapped quietly, mostly out of habit. The seatbelt light flicked off and people scrambled for their bags, eager to disembark. But not Amara. She stayed still. She waited. And then she watched. The first-class curtain peeled back not by crew, but by a man in a black windbreaker with no airline insignia. He stepped in from the jet bridge without announcement, trailed by another man in a fitted gray suit, no tie, and a badge clipped to his chest that didn't flash but carried weight. A third figure followed, a woman with a black bob cut and mirrored aviators, holding a tablet already unlocked. The three of them split up. Windbreaker headed toward Lang. Gray suit stopped Anders. The woman with the tablet walked directly to Halbert, who was still standing in the aisle, clearly attempting to appear calm while failing miserably. The murmurs started almost immediately. What's going on? Is that security? Why are they stopping first class? Some passengers pulled out their phones, but the agents moved with quiet efficiency, making no scene, speaking in controlled voices, just loud enough to signal authority, not enough to start panic. Amara rose slowly, retrieved her tote, and waited in the aisle like everyone else. No one stopped her. No one even addressed her. She didn't need the attention. She already had the leverage. The boy with the camera bag caught her eye from across the aisle and gave a subtle thumbs up. He had recognized her now. Maybe from social media, maybe from the moment she didn't sit down quietly and disappear. She returned the nod, then turned toward the exit. As she stepped into the jet bridge, a fourth agent was waiting by the door. He had a tablet open with the seating manifest visible on screen. He didn't say her name, but he looked at her and said, "You may proceed, MS. Blake. Thank you for your cooperation." That was all. No question, no delay, just quiet acknowledgement from someone who understood. She walked past him, her pace unhurried, and merged with the stream of passengers making their way into the terminal. Outside Gate 32, the lights were brighter, the floor colder, and the buzz of arrivals louder than it had been that morning in Terminal D. But Amara moved through it with the same quiet authority. The only difference was the knowledge that those who tried to shrink her into silence were now answering questions they never prepared for. Back on board, Halbert's voice rose slightly. Amara didn't turn back, but she heard enough to catch fragments. "This is a mistake. I was authorized. We have the override log, sir. I want legal present. Sir, please don't raise your voice." Lang, somewhere behind, was muttering rapidly into his phone, sweating now despite the cool air. Anders stood silently, head lowered. They had never expected this outcome, because they had never imagined that the person they saw as a nuisance could be someone who would hold them accountable. Not publicly, not loudly, but thoroughly, systematically, legally. Inside, as the door clicked shut behind her, Amara connected her tablet to the vehicle's Wi-Fi and activated a secure remote terminal. Her fingers moved fast across the screen, opening encrypted folders, cross-referencing names, timestamps, and access logs from the flight, many of which had just been quietly emailed from within her private cybersecurity division. Within 5 minutes, she had full metadata of the seating override, complete with user IDs tied to employee access. David Lang had authorized the change, but that wasn't the part that intrigued her. It was the signature on the override itself. It hadn't been keyed from inside the aircraft. It had come from a remote administrative terminal. Someone outside the plane had given the order to remove her from Seat 2A, and that someone was logged under a system ID assigned to the airline's director of operations. His name, Mitchell Forrester. Amara recognized it. She had met him once 3 years ago at an aviation summit where he had dismissed her proposal for equitable staffing reforms as idealistic nonsense. Now he was about to become the headline. The car moved smoothly through traffic while Amara pieced the final parts of the puzzle. A pattern had started forming, not just with her own experience, but across dozens of previous incidents. She opened a dashboard compiled from public complaint data, filtered for keywords, reassigned, seat downgraded, unexplained removal, and added one more parameter: passenger race, Black, Hispanic, or South Asian. The list populated rapidly. Over 117 reported cases in the last 14 months. All from first class. All resolved quietly with either travel vouchers or vague apologies. None escalated to legal. Until now. She pressed her earpiece. "Gabriel," she said, addressing her firm's lead strategist, who answered without greeting. "I need you to pull HR data from Skyline Airlines. Look for internal memos related to passenger prioritization, rebooking authority, and special manifest overrides." "Already on it," Gabriel replied. "Want it clean or want it loud?" "Clean first," Amara said. "Loud comes later." The sedan exited the freeway and entered the private gate of Amara's corporate office, an angular, glass-encased structure nestled into the edge of an old naval facility converted into a think tank campus. She stepped out, climbed the marble steps 2 at a time, and entered the briefing center where her core team was already waiting. seated in a semicircle of screens displaying live social metrics, airline response tracking, and legal frameworks. At the center of the room, on the main screen, was a paused image from a flight. Halberd mid-conversation with Lang, both unaware of the camera capturing their exchange. Camille had already begun preparing the first phase of the media plan. Her notes were pinned on the side of the screen. Power speaks loudest when it whispers. Let the facts be louder than the outrage. Amara stood before them without removing her coat. "We are not going to make this about me," she said plainly. "We are going to make this about systems. Because if they did it to me, they've done it to hundreds of others. And we have proof." She clicked the remote in her hand and brought up the seat, override audit logs. Names, times, reassignments. Amara walked them through the timeline of what happened, minute by minute. From the gate scan to the exact second when her name disappeared from the seat manifest, to the moment when Halberd was logged as a replacement. She played audio clips from the mic she had placed in first class. In one snippet, Lang could be heard saying, "Just move her. It's not like she's going to sue. These types never do." In another, Halberd laughed. "If she complains, give her a travel voucher and call it sensitivity training. HR eats that up." The room went still. No one spoke. Then Camille finally whispered, "You just recorded the death sentence of every excuse they've ever used." Amara turned to her legal counsel. "How fast can we file for a federal review of discriminatory passenger treatment protocols?" The man adjusted his glasses and responded, "If we want clean, 3 days. If we want it fast and press-ready, 12 hours. Make it 12, she said, and flag it to the Civil Aviation Oversight Board. Use Clause 18B, manifest manipulation under non-operational pretext. It'll trigger internal reviews across every airline that shares a data pool with Skyline." By now, Twitter was trending with the hashtag seat for sale, and an excerpt from the Instagram video of Amara's calm confrontation with Lang. It had been clipped by a verified social justice account and captioned, "She didn't raise her voice. She just raised the bar." Underneath, comments flooded in. Some shared their own stories. Others demanded an apology from the airline. Some called for boycotts. But Amara didn't read any of it. She focused only on what mattered next. "Begin mapping media angles," she instructed Camille. "I want one thread focused on passenger profiling, another on corporate override loopholes, and a third on how customer service data is manipulated to bury racial complaints under general dissatisfaction." Camille nodded, already typing. "And what do we call this project?" she asked. Amara didn't hesitate. Project Window Seat. By the next morning, they would have a full investigative dossier ready for submission. But even before then, the ripples had started. An anonymous internal employee from Skyline sent Amara's office a file labeled Reclassification Directives. It included a training memo instructing flight staff on how to politely de-escalate seat disputes involving diversity-sensitive passengers, without documenting the incident as a formal complaint. Buried deeper, they found a section marked Quiet Reassignment Protocols. One line read, "In cases where optics may raise concern, prioritize discretion over engagement. File as system error." Amara printed the memo and placed it on the table. She stared at it for a moment, then said aloud, "System error. That's what they called me. A system error." She looked at her team, face unwavering. "Well, now we fix the system." As morning broke over San Francisco, the skyline shimmered under a veil of thin fog and rising heat, but Amara's office buzzed with clarity and friction. Her team had worked through the night, analysts pulling override patterns from FAA database leaks, her legal advisor coordinating with civil rights organizations, and Camille refining the media cascade with surgical timing. The atmosphere wasn't chaotic. It was controlled, like a launch site moments before ignition. On the central screen in the briefing room, Mitchell Forrester's face loomed, a publicity photo from a recent conference where he had spoken about building equitable experiences in modern aviation. The irony tasted like ash. Behind that polished smile was a paper trail of executive overrides that disproportionately affected passengers of color. Amara didn't need to prove his intent. She just needed to prove his consistency. And now she had. Gabriel stepped forward, pointing to a data graph plotted across 6 months. We mapped every first-class reassignment Skyline logged as a system error. 81% of them involved minorities. Of those, 37% were women traveling alone. In 70% of those cases, the reassigned seat went to a white male who booked after the original ticket holder. He clicked, and a new tab opened. Internal emails from a whistleblower. And here's the kicker. Forrester authorized a software tweak that deprioritized passengers with non-legacy status when overrides were needed. That includes anyone not flagged as VIP, frequent flyer elite, or corporate partner. Codes that, conveniently, exclude the majority of their black and brown customer base. Camille chimed in without looking up from her screen. Hashtag window seat just passed 1.8 million mentions. Every news outlet from MSNBC to Vox is requesting statements. The airline is still silent. She paused, then added with a smile, but their stock isn't. It's down 11% since pre-market. Amara didn't gloat. She leaned forward and said quietly, "Good. Let them feel what silence costs." Then she turned to her executive assistant. "Prepare the summit room. I want the media brief out by noon, and schedule a one-on-one interview with Marsha Lynn from NPR. She's not just sound bites. She asks questions people are scared to answer." "And what's the headline?" Camille asked. Amara replied without missing a beat. "When the seat isn't the issue." At exactly 10 a.m., her press director uploaded a 12-minute video titled, "Amara Blake vs. Skyline Airlines, the seat, the system, the silence." It opened with footage from a plane, followed by charts, evidence, excerpts of audio, and then her calm narration. "What happened to me isn't new. It's repeated, renamed, and repackaged every day as policy. But discrimination dressed in protocol is still discrimination, and we're done pretending it's not." Within 30 minutes, the video had reached over 2 million views. Hashtags exploded. Share counts spiked. But most notably, the backlash took a new turn. Former employees of Skyline began stepping forward. Anonymous emails flooded the firm's contact line, filled with documents, first-hand testimonies, screenshots of Slack channels where flight staff were casually warned to be alert with passengers who might not match their section. It was no longer just Amara's story. It had become a collective reckoning. Meanwhile, in the executive wing of Skyline headquarters, panic brewed beneath the surface of scripted press statements and internally distributed FAQs. Forrester had not made a public appearance in over 24 hours. He was scheduled to keynote a transportation equity panel that morning, but quietly withdrew, citing urgent administrative matters. Lang had been suspended pending investigation. Anders, sources confirmed, had been removed from active roster. Still, no one had taken responsibility. That changed at 11:42 a.m. when Amara received a direct message through her encrypted media line. The sender, m.forrester@skylineact.org. The message was brief. "MS. Blake, I believe it's time we speak. Privately." Amara read the message twice. Then she replied, "There's no such thing as private anymore, Mr. Forrester. But if you want to talk, you can do so on record." That same afternoon, Skyline announced an urgent leadership restructuring and scheduled a public apology press conference. But Amara got there first. She released a second video, this one only 4 minutes. In it, she sat in front of a plain background, calm, composed, and unshaken. Her words were simple. Systemic problems are never about one flight. They're about the culture that allows injustice to pass as procedure. "I was told I didn't belong. I was told there had been a system error. But I was never the error. I was the evidence." She let the silence hang before adding, "And now so are you." By 3 p.m., Skyline's board had announced an independent audit. Forrester was placed on administrative leave, a euphemism Amara's team quickly translated for the press as temporary vanishing act. Camille arranged for a roundtable discussion on PBS, where Amara was joined by civil rights attorneys, an FAA representative, and 2 other passengers who had been wrongfully reassigned in the past year. Their stories weren't identical, but they echoed in uncomfortable harmony. One woman, a nurse returning from a conference, had been reassigned mid-flight and told she didn't look like a platinum member. Another, a retired veteran, had his seat handed to a corporate executive while he was in the restroom. Amara didn't lead the conversation. She guided it. She let their voices surface. Let their stories connect. Let the scale of the issue overwhelm any attempt to reduce it to an isolated incident. This wasn't a scandal. This was a structure, and that made it harder to dismantle, but not impossible. Later that evening, after the roundtable aired, a small but significant moment occurred. A high-ranking manager from a rival airline reached out to Amara privately. His message was simple. "We've reviewed our policies. You've made us take a second look. Thank you. If you ever consider working with aviation reform full-time, let us know." Amara didn't reply right away. She didn't need to. She already knew that the seat they tried to take from her had just become a platform. Amara stood at the window with her back to the team, watching the light slowly recede over the bay. She didn't speak right away. Her arms were folded, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she said, "They still think this is about a seat. Even now." Camille looked up from her tablet, wary. "Then let's remind them what it's really about." Amara turned slowly, walked back toward the center of the room, and placed a slim, leather-bound folder on the table. She slid it across to Gabriel, who opened it and froze. Inside were 6 sheets of embossed stationery bearing the seal of the Athena Equity Trust, a global investment fund with over $1.3 billion in active aviation infrastructure development. At the top of each page, beneath the crest, was a single name, Amara E. Blake, Chairwoman and Strategic Director. Gabriel exhaled. "They're not ready for this." Camille's jaw tightened, but her voice was calm. "Neither were we. You've been holding this since the beginning." Amara nodded. "It wasn't relevant. Until now." She tapped a spot on the bottom of the page, an authorization form signed just 6 weeks earlier, approving a proposed allocation of $127 million toward a Skyline-led transcontinental expansion initiative. "That funding hasn't cleared," she added. "It's scheduled for board vote next Friday." The room went completely silent. Camille whispered, "You're the vote." Amara confirmed with a single, measured breath. "And I'm pulling it." No one cheered. There were no high-fives or congratulations. The room understood the gravity. This wasn't revenge. This was realignment. Amara walked to the primary console and brought up a map of the airline's investment footprint, terminal upgrades, supply chain enhancements, emerging route corridors. Every red that represented a project either partially funded or pending approval through Athena. The moment she pulled her name from Skyline's proposal, the entire chain would collapse. "They wanted to erase me from one cabin," she said quietly. "I'll erase them from the industry map." By 7:40 p.m., she had drafted and signed a formal letter of funding retraction, citing systemic integrity breaches and contractual ethical violations. The letter wasn't sent directly to Skyline. It was sent to every major investor in the aviation sector, every regulatory advisory board, and every government partner working with Athena's infrastructure plan. It was not just a financial decision, it was a signal. And within minutes, the reverberation began. Emails flooded in, some cautious, some congratulatory, some panicked. One from the Department of Transportation read simply, "We'd like to meet. Soon." But Amara wasn't done. Not until the public knew what kind of power the woman they tried to silence had always carried. She called Camille into the side studio where their team had recorded the last 2 media drops. The lighting was already set, the camera warmed, the mic live. This time, she didn't want graphs or audio clips. No cuts, no voiceovers. Just a chair, a blank backdrop, and her truth. "Roll it," she said and sat down. For 12 uninterrupted minutes, Amara spoke, not as a victim, not as a viral sensation, not even as a strategist, but as the woman behind the money. She began with the seat, how she bought it, how she lost it, how it made her remember every time she had been told, politely and with a smile, that she did not belong in a space she had earned. Then she shifted. What they didn't know, she said, eyes locked on the lens, was that I wasn't just a passenger on that plane. I was the lead stakeholder in the largest aviation funding initiative this country has seen in the last decade. I didn't need them to let me sit. I was already standing over them. She explained Athena's purpose, her role, the vote. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. Her poise carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken names. Every woman, every person of color, every traveler who had been shuffled, silenced, or stripped of dignity under the guise of protocol. The video went live at 8:19 p.m. and reached 500,000 views in under 20 minutes. By midnight, it had cracked global trends. News anchors called it the most powerful corporate unmasking since the financial collapse. Industry analysts labeled it a regulatory time bomb. And on the front page of every major outlet the next morning, the headlines bore her name in full, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. In one interview, a former Skyline board member anonymously admitted, "We never knew who she was. If we had, none of this would have happened." That was the point. They never asked. They never thought she could be both silent and sovereign. They underestimated a woman who had already built the very future they now needed to survive. Emails between executive staff piled into inboxes with red-flagged urgency, bearing subject lines like crisis containment, stakeholder fallout, and Athena retraction catastrophe. Mitchell Forrester didn't show up to the boardroom that morning. No statement, no call, just silence. The CEO, once known for his proud declarations about building trust through transparency, had gone dark. Instead, Skyline's interim general counsel, a stiff man with a tremor in his voice and a background in corporate litigation, stepped forward to address the press at an emergency conference. The scene was clinical, forced. He stood at the podium, reading from a page with eyes that rarely met the cameras. "We acknowledge that recent events have highlighted serious lapses in judgment and oversight within our organization. Effective immediately, we are initiating a comprehensive audit of all internal protocols related to passenger treatment, seating assignment, and executive override systems. We have reached out to MS, Amara Blake and her representatives to request a direct meeting to address her concerns and rebuild trust." The cameras clicked furiously. Reporters leaned forward. One of them called out, "Is it true Skyline received over $100 million in pledged funding from MS? Blake's investment group?" The lawyer hesitated. I cannot speak to confidential investment negotiations." Another voice shouted, "What exactly are you offering her now? You tried to evict her from a seat, and she ended up evicting your leadership." The general counsel paused, swallowed, then said flatly, "We are hoping for an opportunity to discuss a path forward with MS. Blake, our team is open to full cooperation." The words were measured, hollow, too late. Amara watched the conference from her office, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Camille sat beside her, phone in hand, already receiving new press requests. "You've got CNN, MSNBC, and BBC wanting follow-ups. Also, a call just came in from Skyline's chairman himself. Wants a direct conversation. Privately." Amara raised an eyebrow. "Now they want private?" Camille didn't laugh. "You want to take it?" Amara shook her head. "No. Set the meeting. But not with me. Not one-on-one. I want it on record. Full team. Third-party observers. We'll hold it at the Athena Roundtable. Let them know the only thing I'm offering is accountability." 2 days later, in a glass conference suite overlooking the bay, Skyline senior leadership sat across from Amara's full executive council. A third-party ethics board and an FAA regulatory liaison joined via secure video link. The setting was minimalist, no brand banners, no refreshments, just a long table and truth. Mitchell Forrester, having finally emerged from hiding, sat pale, subdued. He looked nothing like the man who once dismissed Amara's policy suggestions as idealistic nonsense. Today, he wore the fatigue of exposure. His eyes carried the weight of reputation unraveling. He opened with a stiff apology, carefully worded and strategically vague. MS. Blake, we deeply regret the events that occurred aboard Flight 219. They do not reflect our values." Amara sat silently as he spoke, unmoved. She didn't interrupt. She waited. When he finished, she leaned forward slowly and said, "You don't get to define your values after the fact. Your values are what you do when no one is watching. And what you did, what you've done for years, is weaponize invisibility. You built a system where people like me could be quietly removed, reclassified, dismissed without consequence, because you counted on our silence. You were wrong." A hush fell over the room. Forrester didn't respond. He stared down at the table, fingers locked tightly together. Amara continued, "There will be no settlement, no off-record compromise. What I'm offering you is a choice. Step down now, publicly, and allow for a full external investigation with independent oversight. Or resist, and watch this spiral into a federal inquiry that dismantles everything you built." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She spoke like someone used to giving orders, not asking for concessions. The ethics board observed without comment. The FAA liaison, a woman in a navy suit with a silver badge, took notes and nodded slowly. Forrester blinked. Then he exhaled. "I understand," he said. It was the first honest thing he'd said all week. That afternoon, Skyline released a statement. Mitchell Forrester was resigning effective immediately, along with 2 board members and the head of passenger operations. A full independent review would commence within the month. Amara's team didn't comment directly, but they leaked the footage of the roundtable to the press, letting the public see that justice hadn't been negotiated behind doors, but served face to face. Behind the scenes, investors began pulling out. Partners suspended contracts. Other airlines issued statements preemptively, pledging transparency and reform. The ripple had become a wave. But Amara didn't gloat. She knew too well that consequences weren't victory. Consequences were the start. She issued a final public message that night. "I didn't ask for revenge. I asked for recognition. Now we begin the work of repair." The response was overwhelming. Millions of views, hundreds of thousands of comments, most of them thanking her for speaking when so many had been silenced. But the ones that stayed with her were quiet. DMs from employees who had stayed silent out of fear. Messages from passengers who had accepted humiliation as normal. Notes from children whose parents had taught them to never cause a scene. Now they were learning something new. In a live panel hosted by PBS, Amara spoke to a room of airline executives, policymakers, and transportation analysts. She didn't speak about what had happened to her. She spoke about systems, about patterns, about how discrimination isn't always loud. Sometimes it's coded into algorithms, wrapped in procedure, hidden in workflows labeled security or efficiency. She explained how equity isn't a checklist, it's a design choice. And everyone at the table had chosen wrong for far too long. The Department of Transportation launched a formal inquiry into discriminatory seating practices across all domestic carriers. But Skyline was first in the crosshairs. The FAA issued a special bulletin calling for immediate suspension of override protocols without supervisory dual confirmation. And perhaps most devastating of all, the Congressional Subcommittee on Civil Rights in Transportation called for a live hearing, summoning not only Skyline executives, but former flight staff, union reps, and even select passengers who had filed previous complaints, some of whom had never received a reply until now. Amara didn't attend that hearing to speak. She attended to witness. She sat quietly in the 4th row behind a pane of plexiglass, her presence acknowledged but not central. This was intentional. She didn't need to testify. Her work had already testified for itself. On the stand, David Lang looked almost unrecognizable. No longer the polished flight operations manager, but a man unraveling in the face of questions he could no longer deflect. Under oath, he admitted that override requests were not always reviewed, that VIP labels could be applied at staff discretion, and that managers were quietly instructed to avoid assigning passengers of color to the front rows unless they had explicit top-tier status or matching travel profiles. When asked what a matching profile meant, he hesitated. The silence echoed. Then he said, "Corporate preference." The room recoiled. Next came Kay Anders, the flight attendant who had first blocked Amara from entering the cabin. Her tone was defensive, her posture tight. She denied knowing about any discrimination, insisted she was just following the screen, but when confronted with her own audio, recorded by Amara's device and later authenticated, she broke. On tape, her voice had said, "I don't think she's supposed to be up here. Let's move her before someone complains." When the committee played that clip, Anders's mouth tightened. "I said what I was trained to say," she whispered. "We were told to be discreet." A congresswoman leaned forward and asked, "Discreet about what, MS?" Anders. Silence again. This time it wasn't just recoil. It was shame. Outside the hearing, protesters gathered at the Capitol steps. Some held signs with Amara's name. Others simply held up boarding passes, symbols of all the times they were moved, questioned, stared at for having the audacity to exist in a place reserved for the few. Hashtags turned into action. Advocacy groups began compiling class action suits. A coalition of civil rights attorneys filed a sweeping lawsuit against Skyline, citing systemic racial discrimination and willful neglect of federal passenger equity mandates. The case didn't just name executives. It named structures, algorithms, policies, call center scripts, and everything in between. The damage was no longer reputational. It was legal, and it was permanent. Meanwhile, internal leaks from Skyline's HR department revealed even darker truths. Employees of color had disproportionately lower chances of promotion. Staff complaints about bias were often resolved by reassignment or forced leave. In one particularly damning document, a manager outlined a plan to preserve visual cohesion in premium cabins, a sanitized phrase that meant exactly what it sounded like. Amara's team didn't need to spin these revelations. They simply released them in batches, each one carefully verified, time-stamped, and contextualized. The media did the rest. Airline stocks tumbled. Not just Skyline, but others too, afraid they'd be next. Investors demanded answers. Government contracts were put on hold. A senator proposed a bill mandating third-party audits of all airline reassignment logs over the past 5 years. For the first time in a generation, the aviation industry was forced to confront its biases not as PR missteps, but as embedded design flaws. Yet even amidst all this, Amara remained grounded. She continued attending roundtables, advising policy drafters, and meeting with whistleblowers. She turned her office into a de facto clearinghouse for those ready to speak up. Flight attendants, schedulers, IT engineers, they all came forward with stories. One by one, she listened. She logged. She built the architecture of the reckoning. At a university symposium on transportation ethics, she finally spoke again publicly. The auditorium was packed. Students, industry experts, journalists. Amara stood at the podium, her voice steady. Accountability, she said, isn't about punishment. It's about correction. It's about rebalancing a scale that's been tilted for too long, under too many names, against too many people. What happened to me was personal, but what happens next is structural. That's the difference between outrage and change. The room erupted in applause, not for her pain, but for her precision, for how she had weaponized what others dismissed. In the weeks that followed, disciplinary actions swept through Skyline. Several senior executives lost their pensions. Others were placed under internal review for ethics violations. Lang faced termination and potential obstruction charges. Kay Anders voluntarily resigned, later seen speaking at a local DI seminar titled, "How I Lost My Way." But the most defining moment came when the Department of Justice confirmed it was considering civil penalties under the Civil Rights Act for discriminatory corporate behavior in transport services. It had never happened to an airline before. Now it might. 3 months had passed since the hearings, since the lawsuits were filed, since Skyline's name had become synonymous not with travel or prestige, but with prejudice and collapse. The public had shifted their outrage into remembrance, and the industry had begun reconstructing itself under the pressure of reform. But not every ending arrived with handcuffs or resignation letters. Some came quietly, through introspection, guilt, and choices made long after the headlines faded. In a modest community hall on the outskirts of Denver, a group of flight staff gathered on a Saturday afternoon for a workshop titled Equity in the Aisles. It wasn't part of any corporate training. It was something else, organic, initiated by those who wanted to understand what they'd been part of, what they'd helped enable without fully realizing it. In the second row sat Clara Monroe, a former junior attendant who had once served on the same flight as Amara Blake. Clara had kept her head down during that flight, following orders, not speaking up. She hadn't pushed back when Lang told her to confirm the override. She hadn't questioned Anders when she dismissed the seating concern. But she had heard every word, and it stayed with her. After the scandal broke, Clara had quietly left the airline, not out of fear, but because she could no longer pretend she didn't know. For weeks she couldn't sleep, replaying the moment when Amara stood there in front of them, calm, composed, rightful, and they had looked through her as if she were air. Now Clara sat in this workshop beside other former crew members, each with their own story, their own version of silence. She raised her hand and spoke, voice shaking but clear. I didn't say anything when I should have. I was trained to move fast, not to think. I knew what was happening was wrong, but I told myself it wasn't my call, that I wasn't the one making the decision. But I was complicit, and I'm not okay with that anymore. The room was still. Someone behind her nodded. The facilitator, a civil rights advocate from a nonprofit Amara had quietly funded, thanked her, not for her confession, but for choosing to grow. Meanwhile, across the country, in a small office above a community law center in New Jersey, David Lang sat across from a group of college students working on a racial bias project for their ethics class. He had offered to volunteer after months of reflection, therapy, and a personal decision to resign from the industry. The scandal had destroyed his career, but it had also forced him to confront something he could no longer bury: the culture of quiet prejudice he had helped enforce for years. He spoke candidly now, no longer defensive. The problem wasn't just me, he said, but I played my part. Every time I chose convenience over conscience, I deepened wound. I see that now. One of the students asked why he hadn't said anything sooner. Lang paused, then answered, because power makes you believe silence is safer. It isn't. Elsewhere, in a low-lit cafe in Oakland, a woman in a navy coat sat across from Amara. Her hair was shorter now, her tone quieter. It was Kay Anders. She had reached out through a mutual connection, not seeking absolution, but simply the chance to speak. Amara had agreed not because she needed closure, but because she believed in accountability with a human face. Anders stirred her coffee, unsure how to begin. I don't expect forgiveness, she said, and I know I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that what happened changed me. I've left the industry. I've started mentoring young women on ethical decision-making. And every time I speak, I talk about that flight, about you, about how we failed you not because we hated you, but because we didn't see you. That's worse. Amara listened, quiet and still. Then she said, seeing is a choice. So is change. And the fact that you're here means you're choosing both. That matters. Anders nodded, eyes wet but steady. Thank you, she whispered. Not for what you did to us, for what you made us see. In the months that followed, Amara continued her work, not as a face of scandal, but as a force behind reform. Athena's board approved a new initiative, the Blake Standard, a voluntary equity and accountability certification for all transport and service-based corporations. Within the first quarter, 3 major airlines signed on. By the end of the year, 15 more had entered review. The program didn't just check boxes. It overhauled systems, rewrote training protocols, audited passenger data logs, and empowered internal ethics monitors with true authority. Amara never let the program carry her name for vanity. It carried her name because the industry needed to remember who forced them to wake up. She traveled often now, not to escape, but to build. She spoke at universities, at boardrooms, at international conferences. Her message was always the same. That power means nothing if it can't be used to protect dignity. In one memorable keynote, she said, "We don't fix the world by punishing every person who's made a bad decision. We fix it by building a system where the right decision is easier to make." It became a mantra for a generation. 1 year after the flight that changed everything, Amara stood again at an airport, this time not as a passenger, but as the guest of honor for the opening of a new terminal funded by Athena. The dedication plaque bore her name beside a quote she had once whispered to herself mid-flight, when the world still thought she was powerless. It read, "They tried to move me from my seat. Instead, I moved the world beneath them." As the ribbon was cut and applause filled the air, a young black girl in a pilot's uniform walked up to Amara with wide eyes. "My mom showed me your video," she said. "She said I should never be afraid to stay where I belong." Amara knelt, looked her in the eyes, and said, "That seat is already yours. Just make sure you leave it better for the next girl." And so the story closed, not in vengeance, but in vision, not in silence, but in transformation. Because justice isn't just about making the guilty pay. It's about ensuring the next time someone like Amara boards a plane, they don't have to carry the weight of the world just to sit down. The end. If this story moved you, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. We want to hear your thoughts. What moment hit you the hardest? Which twist did you never see coming? And where in the world are you watching from today? Drop a comment below and join the conversation. Your voice matters here.